Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Dr. Paul Alonso is an associate professor in the School of Modern Languages at Georgia Tech. Facundo Suenzo, a doctoral student at Northwestern University and coordinator of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Paul in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples' history and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Facundo will tell us more about Paul's research and career in just a few seconds. Then Paul will present his work, and after that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at any point in time. It's at the bottom of the screen. Facundo will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Facundo, the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and hello, everyone. I'm incredibly honored to have been invited to today's seminar to introduce Professor Paulo Alonso and to co-moderate this very promising presentation at the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Professor Alonso is an associate professor in the School of Modern Languages at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He received a BA in Liberal Arts and Humanities with a major in Literature and Linguistics from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, and an MA in Journalism and Latin American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin, and a Ph.D. in Journalism also from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Alonso has published 2 academic and 3 fictional books. His book, Satiric TV in the Americas, published in 2018 by the Oxford University Press, is a pioneer study on the convergence of journalism, entertainment, satire, politics, and popular culture in Latin America. In 2022, he also published the book 30 Years of Entertainment and Politics in Peru with Editorial Planeta. His research has appeared in prestigious journals such as the Latin American Research Review, the Journal of Popular Culture, Bulletin of Latin American Research, the Journal of Iberian and Latin American Studies, and has been included in various edited collections. As a journalist and author, Alonso also published in some of the most prestigious newspapers in Spanish, such as El País and El Nuevo Herald, and in a diverse international magazine as well. He is currently the director of Polivisión, a bilingual and multimedia outlet based in Atlanta that covers Latino, American, and global cultures. Among the numerous awards and honors he received, in 2018, Professor Alonso was the recipient of the Top Faculty Paper Award from the Magazine Media Division at the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Alonso.
Thank you. Thank you, Facundo and Pablo, for the introduction. I understand now I keep going, right? So let me share my screen so we can just let me see. Sure. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for attending this presentation, and for the invitation to Pablo, to Facundo, and to the center. Today's presentation, I came up with this title, which really is like a summary of the main themes that I've been working on for the past years. I mean, since I've completed my PhD, so it's been like almost 10 years now. And the title is Political Satire, Digital Infotainment, and Alternative Journalism in Latin America. And what I'm going to do during the next 30 minutes or so will be to do an overview on some of the main works and ideas that I've developed and analyzed around these themes. So first of all, let me start a little bit with my background and tell you, to explain a little bit how my interest in these themes developed. I am originally from Lima, from Peru, and I studied literature, as was mentioned. And I was also working as a journalist. I started working as a journalist very young, first in arts and culture sections, and then I ended up doing a little bit of everything. And when I was between 18 to 23 years old, I worked in many newsrooms, in many mainstream and alternative publications in Peru. Some of them, newspapers and magazines mainly. And I developed an idea of some of the different practices of journalism in Latin America. And, I learned some of them. I was very critical of some other ones. And then I moved to Austin in 2004, at the time when digital media, or at the time the blogs, were becoming very prominent and challenging a lot of the journalistic practices and establishment of and the authority of journalism at the time. But there were also some other things that started happening at the time, which is that satire, political satire, had a resurgence in the United States, a particular type of political satire that interpolated and questioned the news media particularly. And I'm talking about the shows like The Daily Show with Jon Stewart or The Colbert Report, which were pioneers of a trend that has still continued, but has evolved, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it was also a very interesting moment for this resurgence of political satire, which is, as you probably know, a genre that has existed since the Greeks and the Romans. It has a very long tradition, literary tradition, but also media tradition. No, satire has existed in most Western societies in some sort of media format. But what happened in the early 2000s was a very particular resurgence in a very particular context. So in the United States, we're talking about the post 9/11, in a very polarized environment. During the Bush administration, the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, and also the emergence of Fox News, which we've been talking about that for almost 20 years now. But now actually in Latin America, I think this is something that we can see replicated. There is a version of this kind of partisan right-wing media propaganda machinery that exists in many Latin American countries too. But at the moment, the appearance of Fox News was very challenging because it would still use the label of journalism, but it was really violating most of the traditional journalistic practices that had existed until the moment. Not that they were always respected, but they were trying to normalize this sort of transgression. And in a way, political satire appeared as a reaction to this. We can see, if you look back to the early 2000s satire, they were targeting the establishment, they were targeting the political institution, the political class. They were pointing out to many issues like the war and inequality, and they were targeting a lot of social vices and issues in society, but they were mainly also targeting the media. No, if you look at the format that many of these shows had, what they did was they were parodying a news show. They were deconstructing the journalism formats, the concepts of news itself, and they were actually showing, exposing how news is a cultural product that is put together. No, they did it through humor, which in a way became very effective to evidence all these biases and partisanships. No, for example, Jon Stewart was parodying the traditional newscast. No, but Colbert was, for example, parodying the pundits, no, particularly the right-wing pundits like O'Reilly and all those kind of Fox News pundits that were appearing and emerging and becoming really influential. No, so he was doing a parody of them and also exposing their flaw reasonings and what he would call truthiness, no, which we will call now fake news. So that's when I became interested in these issues when at that time, and I had already noticed that there was a long tradition that I always found fascinating in Latin America, mainly in the print press, and I'll talk about that in a second. And in order to analyze this phenomenon of what I call of reemergence of political satire, I use a theoretical background that I'm not going to get that much into now, but here are some of the key concepts. I talk about global infotainment, mainly based on Daya Tusu's work of news as entertainment, which really evaluates globally how entertainment was becoming much more part of the news agenda. In general, globally, it was a trend that was happening. Usually traditional formats that were from other usually considered entertainment were crossing the boundaries of what had been considered news, especially starting in the 90s. No, I also use the concept of society of spectacle that comes from the French theorist Guy Debord from the 60s and the 70s, and the movement of the situationists, in which they were talking about what they perceived as the dangers of spectacle dominating the humans' lives and public discourse. And then I also use the notion of carnival, which actually is a little bit older, comes from Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, in which he talks, and this is more particular to the role of humor and satire, which is the role of this sort of carnivalesque language in order to challenge the status quo. No, how through humor and performance and exaggeration and many other strategies like parody, in certain moments, in certain contexts, people, and particularly the court jester figure, is able to challenge the status quo, is able to speak a truth that would not be able to speak, to declare in another context. No, and in a way, we can see that many of these new satirists are like new versions of court jester, of the court jester tradition. No, the ones that are able to speak truth to the king and not getting their heads cut off. And more particularly to the topic, I use these two notions. The one of this hybridity that kind of comes from global cultural globalization studies by Grady, and in Latin America, Garcia Canclini and others, in which they talk about how more and more there is this increasing movement of discursive integration, in which many formats are being melded into previously unimagined combinations. No, Geoffrey Bain, who's done a lot of work on political satire and his hybrid form, talks about this notion of discursive integration as these new formats in which news, entertainment, popular culture, politics, marketing have been becoming increasingly merged and blended into new forms. No, and I guess the reemergence of political satire in the early 2000s was part of this process. And then a concept that I introduced to analyze satire in the US and also in Latin America is the notion of critical metainment, which is kind of a notion that encompasses many of these ideas and in a way tries to summarize how to analyze these new forms, these new hybrid forms that build our traditions, but at the same time bring new things to challenge, to resist some of the establishment's predominant forms, no? So satire as critical metainment is understood as a postmodern carnivalesque result of and a transgressive self-referential reaction to the process of tabloidization and the cult of celebrity in the media spectacle era. And what does this mean is that they build from the tradition of the carnival, but at the same time, they use the carnival to resist many of the pressures of the society of spectacles, particularly the negative ones that affect democratic discourse, like tabloidization. They react to this kind of pressures of spectacle and like celebrity too. But at the same time, they appropriate some of those features. No, political satire is also a form of entertainment media, of media spectacle, but it's trying to build over those characteristics at some sort of superficial level in order to entertain, but at the same time question the same parameters in which this discourse is built. No, that's why it's self-referential. No? That's why political satire mainly had a resurgence in TV, in cable TV. But at the same time, one of its main targets was national TV and cable TV. No, so they are satirizing their own platform, and we'll see that that's a constant in many other places. Okay. So I'm not going to get into all the details. I don't have that much time, but I'm just going to show you some of the ideas that I developed and that I concluded in the book. One is that, so as you can see, these are some of the photos of different satirists in Latin America. Well, one, there's John Oliver that came after Stewart and Colbert here, being British, but making this show in the US. But the other one, the one on the top is a Mexican clown called Broso, then Jaime Bailey in Peru, and Diego Capusotto, or with his show Peter Capusotto y sus videos in Argentina. And all these satiric TV shows, they were all broadcast in national TV or cable TV. In these cases, they were actually, except for Oliver, all in national TV. The programs adopted a critical role in their respective countries, challenging the status quo, traditional journalism, or the prevalent local media culture. That's one thing that they all have in common, and that I think has in common all this sort of political satire that targets the journalism, and that also does political communication, that has some sort of journalistic aspiration within it. At the same time, and this is something that I find particularly relevant and crucial, is that these satiric shows are not only products of their national context, they are reactions to them. And we can see that as the same way that we saw that in the US, there was a resurgence of political satire after 9/11, during the Bush administration, the war in Iraq, in a very tense political climate with the radicalization of right-wing media like Fox News. We can see that, for example, in Mexico, Broso appeared or became particularly popular after the 2000, after ended the regime of the PRI, of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, after 71 years in power, a very corrupt system, a very corrupt monolithic system that ruled Mexico for 71 years, and that had a very questionable alliance with the media, no, and that allowed them many media monopolies and conglomerates to develop, like Televisa, for example. No, he, in a way, he represented the opening of Mexico to this sort of democratic environment, but at the same time, challenging the prevalent media culture at the time, everything that Televisa, for example, was not standing for before, and he kind of opened it up. Then he was actually even co-opted by Televisa, but he remained some sort of subversive voice within that media conglomerate. The other case is Jaime Bailey, who who had a show in Peru called El Francotirador that was mixed journalism and satire in the context after the Fujimori dictatorship, after 2000 again, during the democratic transition in Peru. And again, he reacted to this context. He, through humor and very irreverent satire and comments, was trying to challenge what could be said nationally about corruption, about political elites, about the political system at the time. In Argentina, Diego Capusotto was a very different kind of show, but still had a very interesting political angle, appeared and became super popular after the 2001 economic crisis, socioeconomic crisis, the collapse of the economy in Argentina, and during the Kirchner administration, in which through many of his fictional characters, he was questioning a lot of the increasing polarization between the Peronist or the left wing and the right wing in Argentina. And that's a very complex case that builds from many traditions, like the tradition of rock music in Argentina and the and many of the national narratives in that country. So they react to those contexts, and at the same time they deconstruct the media's claims of authority and tends to have an ambivalent relationship with those media outlets. So it's interesting because they are all these cases did broadcast and became very popular in national TV. Broso appeared in Televisa in Mexico, but he was also very critical of governments during a time that Televisa was always trying to keep the peace. Bailey was also on the verge of resigning or keeping or staying in his TV show, because the owners were also having trouble with what he was saying. But at the same time, he was so popular that they would have lost a lot of money of advertising letting him go. Capusotto was a very interesting case because he appeared in national TV, which during the Kirchner government, and I think in many ways he was criticized in many aspects of what you would consider conservative values and right-wing values, but he was also doing a revision of the left, of the history of Peronism, and even of the many identity traits of the political ideology that was in power at the time. And they were able to remain there because they were popular, and at the same time, within the capitalist structures of TV companies, they were still very profitable. So within their discourses, they all target social vices such as inequality, social injustice, corruption, homophobia, racism, sexism, or violence against vulnerable populations, or some of these, which is interesting. You can see most of the satire and even humor of this time leans towards the progressive side. But at the same time, they also reproduce some of these prejudices. For example, in the case of Broso, it's very interesting. He, of course, tries to be the voice of the poor, of the marginalized in Mexico. But in many of his shows, he does have a lot of sexist components in his humor. Even, there is a lot of moments of objectification of women, etc. In the case of Bailey, for example, who was a bisexual character, openly bisexual character, who even tried to run for president and said that he wanted to be the first bisexual, agnostic, and impotent president of Peru from his satiric TV show. He was very progressive in this kind of issues. Made the bisexuality or gay issues very visible in TV, and he supported, legalization of drugs, gay marriage, and many other progressive movements, reduction of the power of the church in the state, etc. But you can see that he also reproduced a lot of prejudices. For example, he made several racist comments against indigenous people in the Andean areas, and he did reproduce many of the class prejudices in Peru. So a few other things. I think that what I found in not only in this, in many other cases that I include in the book, I just mentioned a few, is that satire tends to reveal what is it's like a thermometer to measure what can be said in media discourse. It reveals the parameters of transgression and the limits of dissent in a national culture. No, I think it was very interesting, especially in the particular context, that they were pushing the limits, what could be said from the restrictions, not only of public discourse, but also of media discourse, of what the political economy of those TV stations were allowing. So they negotiated their capacity to transgress within those rules, no? Within those rules of national TV media conglomerates that have their own interests, no? In Latin America, as you probably know, most of these conglomerates or traditional media outlets are owned by oligarchic families or transnational corporations, and they have had monopolies and concentrated a lot of the press for a long time. One of the other things that these satiric TV shows engaged in was a discourse of a struggle about the truth. There was many mentions in most of these shows, even through humor, to question what is truth in the media. No, so even before the whole debates that we have been seeing the past years about fake news, there was, I think, a concern about how the media was portraying truth, how humor was a way to approach and to reach some sort of truth in public discourse. And through that, they were also establishing some sort of moral authority and trying to get some legitimation. No? Many of them said, well, we're joking. We might be joking using humor. We might even make up some stories to make our points. But through all these strategies, we're actually trying to reach a deeper truth than the one that the media that is supposed to be reporting the news is not doing well. No? And finally, another interesting conclusion is that the adaptation of these formats of political satire is also a product of cultural globalization. No, it's very clear with the format of The Daily Show, for example. Even now, we see there's been an adaptation of that in places like Egypt, Germany, and in Latin America. I think almost every country has a version of The Daily Show, either on national TV, on cable station, or digitally. No, that was a very successful format that I think has already been legitimized as part of the journalistic discourse in many places. No, how it gets legitimized? Well, media outlets, news media outlets, cite their reports very often. No, for example, if you've seen John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, most of the media, from The Guardian to local media in Latin America, cite the reports. For example, the one on La FIFA, on the corruption on the FIFA, has been cited as one of the most in-depth reports, journalistic reports, about that issue. No, so they've really obtained a good amount of legitimation. How am I doing with the time? Okay. Okay. Well, let me go with a few other things. So, well, this is another. So the other one focused on Latin America. I also did some work, and that was all, sorry. All this was published in the, sorry. All these ideas about satiric TV were mainly developed in this book, Satiric TV in the Americas, that I published in 2018 with Oxford University Press. And I've done some other cases that are not just particularly about Latin America. For example, one that I followed very closely is the one of Sacha Baron Cohen. I wrote an article about him in 2016 that was published in the Journal of Popular Culture about his whole critical identity through his different fictional characters. And this past year just appeared with Bertram Surkamp in Germany, in German, which I haven't read in German. I don't speak German, but I wrote it in English, was translated. An update version of his role in the last campaign in which Trump was running for president, with his second Borat movie. In this book, Consents, about consent and dissent, that appeared in Germany. No, so I wrote a chapter about how has this sort of satire evolved globally. No, we can see how he started targeting many of the social tensions of the 90s, multicultural England in the 90s, through his characters of Dali G, Borat, and Bruno, and how that evolved to the second Borat movie in the context of a Trump re-election in which he was really turning much more serious. I mean, he already was becoming the figure of Sacha Baron Cohen, a sort of public intellectual, giving serious speeches against Facebook, against Trump, against xenophobia. I mean, it was very interesting to see how humor or comedians and satirists were reinventing themselves to address new realities. I've also developed some, so I've tried to cover Latin America, particularly in many platforms. This is, I think someone mentioned that paper that won the best paper was this one in the AJMC, was Satiric Magazines as Hybrid Alternative Media in Latin America. And this was actually the first thing that I ever published about satire, which is about satiric magazines, no? Particularly the cases of the Clinic in Chile and Barcelona in Argentina. No? So this article was very, I think, condensed many of my ideas about satiric press as a form of hybrid alternative media through analysis of these two cases that I studied first I went to Buenos Aires and to Chile and did interviews and content analysis in 2005, when I was still, I think my first year of grad school or less. And then I went 10 years later in 2015 and did the same interviews and content analysis of their more recent editions to trace also the evolution of this sort of satiric media outlets, no? I found that both of them started as, they started as very underground countercultural pamphlets, and 10 years later, they had very different ways. The one in Chile became one of the most popular mainstream magazines, I would say was at some point the most read magazine in Chile. And the other one, Barcelona, remained very alternative and very, you would say, even still underground, even though it did have a lot of influence and a cult following, no? Both of them appeared after post-traumatic social periods, no? The Chile appeared in the 1998 when Pinochet was arrested in London, no? And it appeared, as I said, as a pamphlet and evolved into a very successful magazine. And Barcelona appeared after 2001 crisis and economic collapse in Argentina, and did capture very clearly the anger of the working and middle class and certain parts of the middle class at that moment, no? So I think they were also case studies of the evolution, negotiation of the alternative into the mainstream. And now, actually, my current project that stems from the chapter 6 of my previous book is focused on Latin American digital satire, or Latinx and Latin American digital satire. So these are some of the cases that I've analyzed, and I hope I'm actually submitting this manuscript in this year, and ideally will be published in 2024, about the role that and how it has changed. These are some pioneer cases, but how digital satire has changed certain aspects of the communication through satire, through political satire. No, what is the difference for the digital native outlets in contrast to the ones that were still regimented by the limits of TV stations, cable stations, and corporate media? Okay, so many of these, how am I doing with that? So most of what I've just mentioned is work purely on satire, but as I said at the beginning, I've had an interest not only in satire, but also in hybrid forms, no? In hybrid forms that could not only be considered humorous or comedic or satirical. In this book, I focus on the case of Peru to talk about the evolution of infotainment, no? Infotainment, which is a concept, a very complex concept in the sense that a lot of people say it as negative, as some sort of really vacuous, superficial, reinforcing the stereotyping type of content, which has been, I think, for the most part. But then there's also satire, for example, satirical, political satire in the media is a form of infotainment, is a form of, a lot of people would say, positive infotainment that is actually adding to meaningful democratic conversation, no? So in this case, in the case of this book, I trace a little bit of the evolution of infotainment from some of its worst exponents in the 90s during the Fujimori dictatorship in Peru, in which the media was co-opted by the regime. Many of the talk shows, reality shows, actually took a pro-government stand. They became part of the propaganda of the regime, and they took just a role that really supported a corrupt and authoritarian regime that violated human rights. But then also in the after 2000, in the democratic transition, the media and new forms of politainment, of hybrid forms that mix entertainment and information and journalism started taking a much more aggressive discourse against corruption, against the political elites, against other established institutions. No, so in this book, what I do is try to trace a little bit that evolution and see what are the factors that make this form be critical or be complacent. No. And finally, going to the pandemic, this is an article that I published also last year about hybrid alternative digital native media in the context of the pandemic. And this was very interesting for me because it was two cases of two colleagues, journalist colleagues that I know that are both Peruvian living in Madrid. And in the context of the pandemic, those two media outlets, they created two digital media outlets that became, within certain circles, very influential, especially within the journalism world, because they were really filling a gap left by mainstream media in the context of crisis. In the context, in Peru was one of the places worst, the hardest hit by the pandemic at some moment of the pandemic, also led to a lot of polarization. You probably have seen in the news how we've had now, I think, 5-6 presidents in the past 5 years. So there was a lot of political instability, and the media, even the most traditional legacy media, has taken a very partisan stand, very biased, and has really done a very negative performance in terms of the traditional values of journalism. So in this context, this kind of new media outlets were created during the pandemic, really filled that gap. And also they responded to that particular context, no? And one thing that I found out is what, we've been talking about entrepreneurial journalism for a long time, but, people still debate what is it that makes it succeed or not. Well, context, one thing that I found is that context is a lot, no? There were a few traits for their success. One was, for example, that they appeared in a moment when most of the media in Peru was doing a very partisan biased and negative performance. The other one is that there was a context of crisis in which people were really suffering an infodemic, a variety of fake news, and they were really looking for verifiable news. And also, even for their subsistence, other things like in Peru, people were not used to do a lot of electronic payments, because they just didn't feel comfortable doing that. E-commerce was not really that solidly established in Peru. Well, the pandemic changed that. People started buying everything online. So for the first time, a media outlet was able to, in a sustainable way, communicate with their audiences and get, through Patreon and other kind of funding, digital funding sources, to crowdfunding sources, to get money directly from the audience to keep operating, which probably would have not been able except for the digitalization of payments that happened during the pandemic. And finally, I call it hybrid because many of these cases where these were journalists that have been working in traditional and alternative media for over 20 years. So they had credibility, they were kind of known and popular, but at the same time, they were starting very DIY journalism media outlets, maybe just from their living rooms with a very small production team and just using very basic tools, in contrast to the whole apparatus of traditional TV of cable, no? So it was a very particular context and a very interesting case study. And again, they were also using infotainment in many of these cases to communicate this very needed and important information. Okay, well, I'm going to leave it here. I kind of try to showcase a little bit of my studies on the topic of political satire, infotainment, and alternative journalism in Latin America. And now I would like to open for any kind of questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. This was very, very interesting. I would like to remind the audience, if they have questions, they can enter them in the Q&A bottom at the bottom of the screen. I will read it aloud. I would like to start by asking some questions that I have that came when I were listening to your presentation. The first one is the relationship between humor and factuality. The cases you were mentioning are sometimes like unique shows or specific programs or shows that the whole show tends to be satirical. But also, I'm speaking from the case of Argentina. In the last year, it's been more common that traditional, so to speak, TV or like news program, they have been including in their program those specific like satirical moments in which like humor and comedy sort of like enter in the conversation. So my question is, how do you see like this tension between like being specific but also having like segments in more traditional programs or like TV news program? And tied to that, I just read an article by Claudia Mellado and Hermida about the roles that different journalists has on social media, especially in this context of media influencers. And one of the profiles that they describe is this idea of the journalist as a joker, in which they have to come up with humor, irony, and sarcasm to engage with their audience. So again, how is this tension between like something that used to be something very specific, like with a specific personalities doing it, and now like having more traditional journalists engaging in those sort of like activities or genres? Thank you.
Well, I think it's a consequence of the inclusion of segments of political satire within the shows has always existed. I think that tension has existed, in Argentina. I'm thinking, Página 12 was a little bit like that when it started, El Tato Bores was also, there is a long history, particularly in Argentina, of political satire that had to do with the news. And I think the consequence of this global popularization made some of the traditional news media starting to incorporate more of this as part of the format, no? So in order to legitimize these formats. Also, I think, and I don't know, an interpretation might be that maybe many of these formats were actually parodying the traditional form. So it's I guess there's this tension between, well, let me rephrase. So the idea of the tension, I think it's part of the whole discursive integration dilemma. You can see it not only in the tension between news and journalism or between journalist and entertainer, but you can also see it in the concept of politician and entertainer, no? I mean, that which is or leader or political or influential political persona, public figure, and entertainer. No? We've seen that with, Trump was a very interesting case of that. There was an article that, for example, a few articles that appeared in the 2000s in the popularity of political satire, when they say, why is there not a Jon Stewart of the right? No, well, really, they didn't take the form of the comedian itself per se at the moment, but then Trump, in a way, embedded that kind of persona. No, with his outrageous behavior that reminded some sort of Sacha Baron Cohen skit. So I do think that, I don't think the satire itself has changed what journalists want to produce. They are trying to use they are trying to include them instead of competing with them. I think that tension has always existed in the press. Is journalism informing, entertaining, criticizing? We have so many distinctions. You have ideally, the whole premise that we have is that journalism is an essential for democracy. Why? Because it needs to inform citizens about about relevant issues so they can make the best decisions about them. And the second one is to be a watchdog of power. So I think there are many cases to be made that journalism has not been performing those functions and has been trying to entertain mostly. I think political satire kind of called them out on this for the past 2 decades. So now they are, I guess, in many cases, just embracing this sort of hybrid media environment in which most, I would say, authorities are being diluted. Journalism is in a crisis, and it's has been in an economic crisis for a long time. Traditional journalism, there is less young people reading newspapers, reading traditional news. There is less advertising. There has been shortages of staff. So, and there is also an institutional crisis. For the past 20 years, people believe have less credibility on the media. So I think journalism has been navigating using any kind of strategies and cooptations in order to maintain some sort of validity and power. That's why many of these media outlets actually hire many of these political satirists and include them in their TV shows, even though they also criticize them or what they stand for. And that's when the whole negotiation starts happening.
This is very interesting. Thank you. We have one question from the audience. Celeste Wagner, she says, thank you for your presentation, Paul. You mentioned that satiric TV usually falls within the limits of dissent in a national culture, and that it sometimes reproduces certain categories of discrimination by critiquing them. I was wondering if you had found cases in which satiric TV could not update quickly enough to certain social changes. I'm particularly thinking about the role of feminist waves in different contexts and the fact that many satiric TV personalities sometimes tend to reproduce rather masculine forms of humor. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. Actually, I forgot to mention something about that. As you can notice from most of the cases that I analyzed, especially one on TV, they were mostly men. That has changed, I think, in the past years. I think in Argentina, particularly, you had the case of Malena Pichot, who was a pioneer video blogger first, and then I think a comedian and entertainment persona with a feminist discourse that's been very prevalent and influential in the country and regionally, I would say. I think it's beyond Argentina. She's kind of known in the region. So I do think that has changed. I think there is much more representation of women and feminist voices within comedy and within satire. I think the transition, of course, usually is not homogeneous, and it's also very dependent on the platform. I think television tends to be in certain countries the slowest platform to update, because they are trying to appeal to wider masses, so they don't really want to take many risks with content to not alienate their audiences. But at the same time, what I meant with being the limits of dissent is that, one thing that I notice is when you look at satire, reverent satire in the UK or in the US or in Argentina or in Ecuador, societies are so different that what can be said and tolerated even as irreverent is very different in all. No, for example, in Ecuador, they had this very popular digital humor outlet called Enchufe TV, which I think it's very interesting, but it's very had to do very much with the moment of Ecuador and Correa's Ecuador at the time, you know, which Correa was a socialist, but at the same time described himself as a Christian socialist, and he was against abortion rights and legalization of gay marriage and many other kind of progressive issues that were, you know, were accepted much more positively by other left-wing leaders in other countries. No, so what I said is that they were trying to question some of these things, but their language is much more milder, less aggressive, less irreverent. Also because there were some laws that were much more restrictive on what could be said to avoid libels and suit and fees and all these kind of issues.
Thank you, Paul. We have another question from the audience. Chris Meyer asked, some newer research on the effects of political satire shows that, at least in the US, political satire can lead to viewers feeling cynical about the states and their governments. And so while some political satire programs might lead to more democratic behaviors, voting, activism, protesting, other political satire programs may impede these behaviors. Have you noticed this trend in Latinx political satire?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, there was, you know, at the time when most of the academic work was celebrating all the potential that political satire was opening in the media and the influence and how they were gaining track with young audiences. There were some scholars that noticed, well, yes, they are really doing a lot of criticism on very important issues, but they could also be leading people into cynicism. So if everything is wrong, what can we do about these kind of situations? They were not really giving any possible answers to any of the issues that we were just criticizing, and etc. I think one thing that I noticed after that criticism is that a lot of these political satirists started doing much more, becoming much more activist in different ways. No, for example, one that I noticed is Colbert. I don't know if you guys remember when he opened his PAC, no, which actually was awarded for being, you know, the PAC, the one that, you know, to teach. He was doing this whole show. He opened it. He created a whole persona running for office in order to expose how money is gathering a political campaign. And what he really did with that whole performance was to really teach the people to understand how politics was funded. So it was not just criticizing, it also took a teaching dimension, right? In the case of Peru, for example, I think that Bailey, for example, trying to run for president was also not just cynicism, but was really putting a lot of ideas on the news agenda. Even the president at the time commented on his potential presidential campaign. No, I think John Oliver, also with many of his reports that are satirical journalistic reports, do engage into affecting and creating some sort of solution for many of the problems that he's addressing in his show. So I do think there was a movement from just cynical or ironic commentary into much more action-driven satire. But at the same time, I think the effect of political satire is very much dependent on the audience, on in what I call satiric literacy. No, and I've noticed that in Peru, yes, and in many other Latin American countries. No, there are countries in which, you know, I think most of the media discourse is so used to some sort of really prejudiced, traditional, old school humor that satire is sometimes not very properly understood in its critical dimension. No? And that happened here in the US too, when Colbert appeared and he was parodying all these right-wing pundits. A lot of right-wing people that watched his show I mean, of course, most of the liberals understood all the criticism that he was doing, but many uneducated conservative right-wing people actually thought he was a real character and agreed with him, and that kind of reinforced his views on that. And that has happened with a lot of complex satire. No? With Borat, that happened too. There was a lot of people that understood it as what it was meant to be, which is a whole critique, social and political critique on core American values. But other people were actually just laughing at how stupid Borat was, right? So levels of education and a lot of other components that I actually developed in my new book about the notion of satiric literacy, I think are relevant to understand these kind of effects.
This is very interesting. Also thinking about the relation between satire and fake news or misinformation. I think that Mora has a question. She will ask it.
Yes, if Facundo, can you allow me to activate my camera? Otherwise, I can just start with my voice. Thank you, Professor Alonso, for the super interesting and fun presentation. I have a question about social media culture and about how you see...
To be able to unmute your video if you want.
Let me see. Yes, I can. Hi there. Gracias. So I'm thinking about this sort of not new, but contemporary form of humor that's very associated with memes and memetic culture and social media, which is the idea of self-deprecating humor, right? Sort of like a comedy roast, but in which there are no other individuals but oneself who's criticizing oneself, you know, and making fun of oneself. How do you see this emergence of self-deprecating humor in memes and in social media culture as related to some way of political or like TV satire? Do you see any kind of relation there? I just wonder that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And well, one thing is I'm very interested in meme culture. I haven't written anything. I'm actually trying to find people who is interested in that, maybe work on a project. So if there is anyone, please reach out to me. I think there are two things these are two different things. Self-deprecating humor has a long tradition, no? And I don't think it's particularly to social media. No, so I think social media has some particularities, not just with self-deprecating humor, but with the language, how it is translating different humorous traditions. Self-deprecating humor, though, is, and I think some of the most interesting stuff that I read about it is about Jewish American self-deprecating humor, no? And usually self-deprecating humor is part of societies, has been prevalent in societies that had experienced some sort of collective trauma. Because it's like a very effective way of social catharsis and a way to heal collectively, no? One thing that you can notice, for example, that I noticed, for example, in the clinic from Chile, after the Pinochet dictatorship, it was one of the first media outlets that became popular by doing a lot of really strong and uncomfortable humor, self-deprecating social humor about a society that tolerated a dictator, and even during the democratic transition didn't do anything to start a new conversation about it for many years, no, until he was incarcerated. In Peru, I think there is also that, you know, because of the shared responsibility of many people in supporting our authoritarian and anti-democratic regime, no? Or so I think there is that notion of too soon sometimes, and I think self-deprecating humor is what marks the moment of too soon is not too soon anymore, right? So we can starting to heal together, and I think reach some sort of catharsis, and I think that has existed for a long time. And again, I do think it's source of trauma, and I think we can talk a lot about from Freud to Lacan to understand that part. And then social media probably does have that too. I don't think it's particular to them. I think memes and many other kind of forms of communication have taken some sort of particularities, but I think that might be one aspect of a predominant trend, but not unique to it.
Thank you, Paul. This was a fabulous seminar. Thank you, Facundo, for great moderation. Thank you to our audience for staying with us through the end and a couple of extra minutes. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day and weekend. We'll see each other again at the next installment of this virtual seminar series. Thank you very much again, Paul. This was terrific.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And please reach out if anyone wants to work on social media and mimetic culture.
Excellent. Thank you. Bye now.